The autumn leaves rustled beneath Emma Bennet's feet as she walked through Highbury Fields, her favourite shortcut home from St Margaret's Academy. At 19, she was in her final year of A-levels, and the weight of her textbooks seemed particularly heavy that Wednesday afternoon. The October wind whipped through her chestnut hair, carrying with it the distinct scent of rain and fallen leaves that characterized London's autumn. Emma adjusted her school blazer, its deep navy colour a stark contrast against the golden and crimson foliage scattered across the park. Her mother, Sarah, had warned her countless times about taking the park route home, especially with the recent neighbourhood watch meetings discussing suspicious activities in the area. But Emma loved this path. It gave her precious moments of peace between the structured chaos of school and home. Today, however, something was different. As she approached the old Victorian bandstand, she noticed a figure she hadn't seen before. Sitting on one of the weathered benches was a man who looked to be in his 50s, though it was hard to tell beneath his unkempt beard and worn clothing. What caught Emma's attention wasn't his appearance, but rather the way he was staring at a dog-eared book in his hands, turning the pages with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Emma's mind flashed to her mother's warnings. "Don't talk to strangers in the park, love. Times aren't what they used to be." Her father, James, a local accountant known for his cautious nature, would certainly agree. He had even offered to drive her home from school, but Emma had insisted on maintaining her independence. She was about to hurry past when she noticed the title of the book, Pride and Prejudice. It was the same novel they were currently studying in her English literature class. The coincidence made her pause, her hand instinctively touching the water bottle and apple in her school bag, extra provisions her mother always insisted she pack. The man must have sensed her presence because he looked up, and Emma was struck by the intelligence in his eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone dangerous. They were tired, yes, but there was something familiar about them, something that reminded her of her former teachers. "You're reading, Austin." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. The man seemed startled by her address, but offered a slight smile. "Yes," he replied, his accent educated, refined even. For perhaps the 100th time, one finds comfort in familiar stories. Emma shifted her weight from one foot to another, conscious of every warning she'd ever received about talking to strangers. But there was something about this man that didn't fit the narrative of danger her parents had constructed. Perhaps it was the way he handled the book, or how he spoke about it with such reverence. "We're studying it in class," she ventured, taking a small step closer but maintaining a safe distance. "I'm supposed to write an essay about Elizabeth's prejudices." "Ah," he nodded, "the heart of the novel, isn't it? How our preconceptions can blind us to the truth about others." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on Emma. Here she was, fighting her own prejudices about this stranger in the park. She reached into her bag and pulled out the water bottle and apple. The man's eyes widened slightly as she held them out. "Would you like these? My mum always packs extra and I never eat them anyway." He hesitated, pride warring with need in his expression. "That's very kind, but—" "Please," Emma insisted. "It's getting cold and they'll only go to waste otherwise." After a moment's pause, he accepted the offerings with trembling hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's been a while since someone—" He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest, despite the autumn chill. "I'm Emma," she said, surprising herself again. "John," he replied simply. "John Harrison." The distant chiming of church bells reminded Emma of the time. "I should go," she said, suddenly aware of how long she'd been standing there. "My parents will be wondering where I am." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Thank you, Emma, for the refreshments and for seeing me." As Emma walked away, her steps quick against the gathering dusk, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was significant somehow. She didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others in her community. That evening, as she sat at the dinner table with her parents in their cozy Victorian terrace house in Highbury, Emma chose not to mention her encounter in the park. Her mother was serving her famous shepherd's pie, and her father was discussing the day's events at his accounting firm. Everything was normal, ordinary, safe, but Emma's mind kept wandering back to John and his copy of Pride and Prejudice, wondering about the story behind the educated man on the park bench. Little did she know tomorrow would bring revelations that would challenge everything she thought she knew about kindness, judgment, and the power of human connection. The next morning dawned grey and misty, typical of London in October. Emma sat at her desk in her English literature class, her mind wandering back to her encounter with John Harrison. Miss Winters was discussing the themes of social class in Pride and Prejudice, but Emma found herself thinking about the well-worn copy she'd seen in John's hands. "Miss Bennet," Miss Winters' voice cut through her reverie, "would you care to share your thoughts on Elizabeth's initial impression of Mr. Darcy?" Emma straightened in her chair, grateful for her thorough reading of the novel. "She judges him based on appearances and social expectations," she replied, the parallel to her own recent experience striking her. "But she learns that first impressions can be misleading." "Excellent observation." Miss Winters nodded approvingly. "Prejudice often blinds us to the truth about people." As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Emma's best friend Charlotte Rivers fell into step beside her. "You seem distracted today," Charlotte observed, adjusting her red school scarf. "Is everything all right?" Emma hesitated. Charlotte was typically level-headed, but she also came from a family known for their conservative views about social issues. "Just thinking about the essay," Emma replied, feeling guilty about the half-truth. They walked together through the school corridors, their footsteps echoing against the worn wooden floors of St. Margaret's historic building. Charlotte was chattering about the upcoming autumn formal when Emma spotted something unusual through the main entrance's glass doors, a police car parked in front of the school. Two officers in uniform were speaking with Mrs. Henderson, the headmistress, who gestured in Emma's direction when she spotted her. Emma's heart began to race as the officers approached. "Miss Emma Bennet?" the female officer asked, her expression professional but kind. "I'm Detective Sarah Collins, and this is Officer James Parker. Could we have a word?" Charlotte squeezed Emma's arm supportively before discreetly stepping away. Mrs. Henderson ushered them into her office, its oak-paneled walls and leather-bound books usually providing comfort, but now feeling oddly oppressive. "Miss Bennet," Detective Collins began once they were seated, "we understand you were in Highbury Fields yesterday afternoon." Emma's throat felt dry. "Yes, I was walking home from school. Did you happen to interact with anyone there?" The question hung in the air for a moment as Emma considered her response. She thought about John, about the intelligence in his eyes and his genuine appreciation for literature. "I spoke briefly with a man who was reading Pride and Prejudice," she admitted. Officer Parker leaned forward slightly. "Did he tell you his name?" "John Harrison," Emma replied, watching as the officers exchanged glances. Is he in some kind of trouble?" Detective Collins pulled out a photograph and placed it on Mrs. Henderson's desk. It showed a younger, well-dressed version of John standing in front of what appeared to be a school. He wore a teacher's lanyard and a warm smile. "This was taken 5 years ago," she explained. "Mr. Harrison was a highly respected English teacher at Bromley Grammar School." Emma stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this image with the man she'd met in the park. "What happened to him?" "We've been looking for Mr. Harrison for several months," Detective Collins continued carefully. "There was an incident involving school funds that were found missing. Mr. Harrison disappeared shortly after. We believe he may have information that could help us understand what happened." Emma felt her world tilting slightly. The man who had spoken so eloquently about literature, who had handled his book with such care, was wanted by the police. It didn't make sense. "The thing is," Officer Parker added, "several witnesses have reported seeing him around Highbury Fields, but you're the first person who's actually spoken with him. We'd like you to tell us everything you can remember about your interaction." As Emma recounted the previous day's events, she found herself choosing her words carefully, wanting to convey the gentleness she'd sensed in John. She described his educated manner of speaking, his obvious love for literature, and the resignation in his eyes when she offered him the food and water. Mrs. Henderson, who had remained silent throughout the interview, finally spoke. "Emma has always shown exceptional judgment," she said, her tone protective. "If she felt comfortable enough to speak with this man, perhaps there's more to the story than we know." Detective Collins nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what we're trying to determine. Miss Bennet, we may need to speak with you again. Would you be willing to help us understand this situation better?" Emma nodded, though her mind was racing with questions. As she left Mrs. Henderson's office, she found Charlotte waiting anxiously in the corridor. The school day was over and students were streaming past them, their chatter and laughter creating a stark contrast to the gravity of what had just transpired. "Emma, what happened? Why were the police asking about you?" "I can't really talk about it right now," Emma replied, gathering her thoughts. "I need to get home. My parents should know about this." As she walked home, taking the long route around the park this time, Emma couldn't shake the image of John Harrison in that photograph. What had happened to transform a respected teacher into a homeless man reading Austen on a park bench? And why did she have a nagging feeling that there was much more to this story than missing school funds? The autumn wind had picked up, sending leaves swirling around her feet as she approached her house. Through the front window, she could see her mother moving about in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she did every evening. Emma took a deep breath, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would change everything. The police visit was just the beginning. She could feel it in her bones. "You did what?" Sarah Bennett's wooden spoon clattered against the kitchen counter, sending droplets of tomato sauce across the pristine surface. Emma had just finished telling her parents about both her encounter with John Harrison and the subsequent police visit. James Bennett removed his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture Emma knew all too well as a sign of mounting stress. "After all our warnings about speaking to strangers," he said, his voice measured but tense. "Emma, what were you thinking?" Emma stood her ground in their warm kitchen, the familiar scent of her mother's cooking now mingling with the sharp tang of anxiety. "He was reading Pride and Prejudice, Dad. He spoke like one of my teachers. I just knew he wasn't dangerous." "Wasn't dangerous?" Sarah interrupted, her face flushed. "The police are looking for him, Emma. He could have been anyone, done anything." "But he didn't," Emma interjected. "And the police said he was a teacher. There has to be more to the story." James raised his hand, silencing both women. "Detective Collins, you said? I think I should give them a call. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with here." As her father left the kitchen to make the call, Sarah began aggressively wiping the sauce splatters, a habit she'd developed to manage stress ever since Emma could remember. "I just don't understand, Emma. We raised you to be more cautious than this." Emma watched her mother's methodical cleaning, choosing her next words carefully. "Mum, do you remember when you told me about how you and Dad met? How everyone thought he was just a rebellious motorcycle rider, but you saw something different in him?" Sarah's hand stilled on the counter. "That was completely different." "Was it? You said you trusted your instincts about Dad even when your parents warned you against him. That's what I did with John." "I saw something in his eyes, something genuine." Before Sarah could respond, James returned to the kitchen, his expression complicated. "I've just spoken with Detective Collins," he announced. "The situation is more complex than it appears." Both Emma and Sarah turned to him expectantly. It seems Mr. Harrison was indeed a highly respected teacher at Bromley Grammar. He was actually awarded Teacher of the Year by the London Education Board 5 years ago. The missing funds, well, there's evidence suggesting he might have been framed by someone else at the school. Emma felt a surge of vindication. "So he's innocent?" "Not exactly," James continued, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "Rather than stay to clear his name, he disappeared. The police believe he may have been protecting someone. They've been looking for him because he's a key witness, not a suspect." Sarah slowly sat down beside her husband. "But why would he choose to live on the streets if he's innocent?" "That's what they're trying to understand," James replied. "Detective Collins asked if you'd be willing to help them, Emma. They think he might trust you since you showed him kindness." Emma's heart leaped. "Of course I'll help. What do they need me to do?" "Now hold on," Sarah interjected. "This is still a police matter. Emma's just a student." "A student who might be able to help an innocent man," Emma countered. "Mum, if someone's been wrongly accused, don't we have a responsibility to help?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of the sauce on the stove. Through the window, Emma could see their neighbour, Mrs. Thimbleton, walking her Yorkshire Terrier past their house, completely unaware of the drama unfolding within. How many other stories, Emma wondered, lay hidden behind the neat facades of their quiet suburban street? James cleared his throat. "Detective Collins suggested a supervised meeting. They've been monitoring the park, and they believe Mr. Harrison returns there regularly around the same time. They think Emma might be able to talk to him again, help him understand that coming forward is his best option." "Under police supervision?" Sarah asked, her protective instincts evident in her tone. complete surveillance, James assured her. They'd have plainclothes officers throughout the park. Emma would never be in any danger. Emma looked between her parents, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Her mother's initial anger had transformed into worried consideration, while her father seemed to be wrestling with his natural caution and his strong sense of justice. "There's something else," James added, glancing at his daughter. They found out more about his background. Before everything happened, he was caring for his wife, Caroline. She had early-onset dementia. After he disappeared, she was moved to a care facility. She's been asking for him. The revelation hung heavy in the kitchen air. Emma thought about John sitting alone in the park, reading the same book over and over, perhaps finding solace in its familiar pages while carrying such a burden of loss and separation. "When would this meeting take place?" Sarah finally asked, her voice softer now. "Tomorrow after school," James replied. Detective Collins would brief Emma thoroughly beforehand. Emma watched as her parents exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that had developed over 20 years of marriage, where entire conversations seemed to pass between them without a word being spoken. "I need to do this," Emma said quietly. "Not just for the police, but for John. You didn't see him, Mum. He's lost everything. Maybe this is a chance to help him get some of it back." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You have your father's sense of justice," she said, with a slight smile. "And my stubborn heart." "Is that a yes?" Emma asked hopefully. James nodded slowly. "Under strict conditions. We'll need to know exactly how this will work, and I want to be nearby when it happens." As her parents began discussing the logistics with renewed purpose, Emma's thoughts returned to John Harrison and his worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. She understood now why that particular book might have meant so much to him. A story about overcoming prejudice and finding redemption through truth. Tomorrow, she would try to help him write his own ending to a story that had gone so terribly wrong. The sauce on the stove had reduced to a perfect consistency, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of home and family. Emma wondered where John would be eating dinner tonight, and hoped that soon, very soon, he too would find his way back to the warmth of home. The next day felt surreal to Emma as she sat through her classes at St. Margaret's. Even Charlotte's constant concerned glances couldn't penetrate the fog of anticipation surrounding her thoughts. During lunch break, Detective Collins had briefed her in Mrs. Henderson's office, providing her with a small, discreet earpiece through which they could communicate if necessary. "Remember," Detective Collins had said, "the goal is to help him understand that coming forward is the best option. Don't push too hard. Let him talk. Sometimes people just need someone to listen." Now, as the autumn sun began its early descent, Emma found herself approaching Highbury Fields once again. This time, however, she wasn't alone. She knew her father was parked discreetly on a nearby street, and plainclothes officers were stationed throughout the park. Detective Collins had shown her their positions on a map, but Emma tried to push that knowledge aside, wanting to maintain the natural demeanor that had worked so well in her first encounter with John. She spotted him on the same bench, almost as if he had never left. Today he wore a different jumper, still worn but cleaner than yesterday's, and his beard seemed slightly neater. The copy of Pride and Prejudice was still in his hands, but this time he wasn't reading. Instead, he was staring at something in the distance, his expression lost in thought. "Hello, John," Emma said softly as she approached. He startled slightly, then relaxed when he recognized her. "Emma," he replied, a mixture of warmth and wariness in his voice. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again." "I brought tea today," she said, holding up 2 paper cups from the local cafe. "Earl Grey. It's getting colder." John's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the cup. "You shouldn't be so kind to me," he murmured. "Especially now that you know." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Know what?" "I saw them watching the park this morning," he said quietly. "The police. They must have talked to you by now." His eyes, still sharp despite his circumstances, scanned the park. "They're here now, aren't they?" Emma sat down on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. "Yes," she admitted, "but they're not here to arrest you. They say you might be able to help them understand what really happened at Bromley Grammar." John took a sip of tea, his shoulders hunching as if under an invisible weight. "Sometimes understanding makes things worse, not better." "Is that why you left Caroline?" The name of his wife seemed to physically impact him. He closed his eyes, pain etching deeper lines into his weathered face. How much did they tell you? That she's in a care facility. That she asks for you. Emma paused, watching his reaction carefully. John, what really happened with the school funds? For a long moment, only the rustling of leaves and distant traffic filled the air. When John finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Caroline's care was expensive. The school's insurance wouldn't cover it. Early-onset dementia wasn't in their policy. I was desperate. He paused, taking another sip of tea. But I never took that money. Then who did? Marcus Blackwood, the deputy head. He knew about my situation, knew I was vulnerable. When money started going missing from the school accounts, it was easy to make it look like I was responsible. All those extra hours I spent at school, the desperate notes I'd written asking about additional insurance coverage, my obvious financial struggles. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. But why would he do that? Because I knew something about him, John replied, his voice gaining strength. I had discovered irregularities in the school's building renovation contracts. Companies owned by his family members winning bids without proper competition, inflated costs, kickbacks. When he realized I was connecting the dots, he struck first. Why didn't you fight back? Show them the evidence. John laughed bitterly. The evidence was on my school computer and in files I kept in my office. By the time I realized what was happening, everything had been accidentally corrupted or lost in a convenient office reorganization. It was my word against his, and he had manufactured a very convincing paper trail pointing to me. Emma leaned forward. But surely there must be some way to prove— I did keep one thing, John interrupted, his hand instinctively going to the inside pocket of his worn jacket. A USB drive with some of the original contracting documents, but exposing it would mean— He trailed off, looking around nervously. Would mean what, John? Blackwood made it clear that if I caused any trouble, Caroline's care would be impacted. He has connections on the hospital board. I couldn't risk her care being compromised. She needs that facility. It's one of the best in London for dementia patients. Emma felt a surge of anger. So you chose to live on the streets instead? To let everyone believe you were guilty? Sometimes the price of protecting those we love is our own reputation, John said softly, his fingers tracing the worn cover of Pride and Prejudice. Caroline might not always remember my name now, but she's safe, that's what matters. Emma sat back, processing this information. Through her earpiece, she could hear Detective Collins breathing steadily, taking in every word. Somewhere in the park, officers were undoubtedly recording this entire conversation. John, Emma said carefully, what if I told you there might be a way to make things right? The police aren't looking to arrest you, they want to help. And my father, he knows people on the hospital board too. Good people. We could ensure Caroline's care isn't compromised while you tell your story. John's hands tightened around his paper cup. Why would you do this? Why do you care? Because sometimes people deserve a second chance, Emma replied, thinking of her mother's words about trusting her instincts. Because I believe you're a good man who was forced into an impossible situation. And because Caroline deserves to see her husband again. A single tear rolled down John's cheek, disappearing into his beard. In the distance, a police siren wailed, making him flinch. Emma reached out slowly and placed her hand on the bench between them, not quite touching him but offering a bridge. Will you let us help you, John? The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across Highbury Fields. In the gathering dusk, John Harrison looked at the young girl who had shown him kindness when the rest of the world had turned away, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. John's whispered yes set in motion a chain of events that transformed the quiet evening in Highbury Fields into a flurry of activity. Detective Collins emerged from her concealed position, approaching with measured steps to avoid startling him. Emma watched as other plainclothes officers materialized from various points around the park, their movements careful and coordinated. Mr. Harrison, Detective Collins said softly, thank you for agreeing to talk with us. Would you be willing to come to the station to make a formal statement? John clutched his copy of Pride and Prejudice closer to his chest, his knuckles white. Emma noticed how he seemed to shrink into himself despite his earlier resolve. The USB drive, he said, voice trembling. I need assurances about Caroline first. James Bennett chose that moment to approach, his familiar presence providing Emma with a sense of security. Mr. Harrison, I'm James Bennett, Emma's father. I've already spoken with Dr. Catherine Murray at the London Neurological Care Centre. She's on the hospital board, and has assured me personally that your wife's care will be protected, regardless of what happens next. The tension in John's shoulders eased slightly. You've already arranged this? My daughter believed in you, James replied simply. That was enough for me to make some calls, Doctor. Murray is actually quite interested in reviewing your wife's case personally. She's one of London's leading specialists in early-onset dementia. Emma watched as John processed this information, his academic mind visibly working through the implications. She could see the exact moment when hope began to replace fear in his eyes. There's something else you should know, Detective Collins added. We've been building a case against Marcus Blackwood for the past year. Your evidence could be the key to breaking it wide open. You're not alone in this anymore, Mr. Harrison. John slowly reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, battered USB drive attached to a fraying lanyard. 5 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've carried this for 5 years, never sure if I should use it or destroy it. Detective Collins accepted the drive carefully, as if handling a precious artifact. Would you be willing to walk us through the contents? We can do it at the station where it's warm. We'll provide you with tea, proper food. Could Emma come? John interrupted, looking uncertainly at the young girl who had changed everything. I trust her. Detective Collins glanced at James, who nodded after a moment's consideration. I'll be coming as well, he said firmly. As they walked toward the waiting police car, Emma noticed how John kept looking back at his bench, as if saying goodbye to a friend. The copy of Pride and Prejudice remained clutched in his hand, a lifeline to his former self. The police station was nothing like the imposing buildings Emma had seen on television. Instead, it was a modern structure with warm lighting and surprisingly comfortable chairs in the interview room. Detective Collins had arranged for sandwiches and tea, and Emma watched as John ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned to make every meal last. For the next 2 hours, John meticulously walked them through the contents of the USB drive. Emma, sitting quietly in the corner with her father, was amazed by the transformation she witnessed. As John explained the complex web of fraudulent contracts and shell companies that Marcus Blackwood had created, his teacher's voice returned. His hands moved with authority as he pointed out discrepancies in documents displayed on the detective's laptop, his expertise evident in every observation. The pattern becomes clear when you look at the subsidiaries, John explained, indicating a complicated chart he'd helped them create. Every major contract went to a company that could be traced back to the Blackwood family, but it was hidden behind layers of shell corporations. I started noticing when the same postal addresses kept appearing on different company registrations. Detective Collins nodded appreciatively. This is exceptional work, Mr. Harrison. You didn't just collect evidence, you created a complete audit trail. I was an English teacher who graded papers for 20 years, John replied with a ghost of a smile. The attention to detail becomes second nature. As the evening progressed, Emma noticed subtle changes in John's appearance. Someone had brought him a comb and given him access to a bathroom. His beard was now neatly trimmed and his face washed. With his intelligence shining through and his posture straightening, she could see traces of the respected teacher from the photograph. A gentle knock at the door revealed Sarah Bennett, Emma's mother, carrying a garment bag. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, taking in the scene. "I brought some of James's clothes, Mr. Harrison. I thought you might appreciate a change." The simple act of kindness brought tears to John's eyes. "Why are you all helping me like this?" Sarah set the bag down carefully. "Because my daughter saw something in you worth saving, and because everyone deserves a chance to set things right." Detective Collins closed her laptop. "I think we've done enough for tonight. Mr. Harrison, we've arranged a room for you at a nearby hotel. Tomorrow we'll need to continue this conversation and begin formal proceedings against Mr. Blackwood. But first, I think you need rest." And she paused, sharing a look with James Bennett. "There's someone who'd very much like to see you." John's breath caught. "Caroline." "Dr. Murray has arranged for a supervised visit tomorrow morning," James explained. "She thinks seeing you might be beneficial for Caroline's condition." Emma watched as John pressed his hands to his face, overwhelmed by the rapid changes in his circumstances. In just a few hours, he had gone from a homeless man in the park to someone with a future again, someone with a chance to reclaim his life and reputation. "Emma," he said suddenly, looking up at her, Would you hold on to this for me?" He held out his worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. Are you sure? You helped me write a new ending to my story, he said softly. It seems fitting that you should keep the book that brought us together. As Emma accepted the novel, she could feel years of hope, fear, and survival embedded in its weathered pages. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the formal investigation, the confrontation with Marcus Blackwood, the emotional reunion with Caroline. But for now, in this moment, she understood that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Outside the police station, London's night sky had cleared, revealing a scatter of stars above the city lights. A new chapter was beginning, not just for John Harrison, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by a simple conversation on a park bench. The London Neurological Care Centre stood in stark contrast to John's recent accommodations. Its modern architecture featured large windows that allowed natural light to flood the corridors, while carefully tended indoor plants created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a high-end hotel than a medical facility. Yet John Harrison, now wearing James Bennett's carefully pressed clothes, had never felt more nervous. Caroline has good days and challenging days, Dr. Catherine Murray explained as she led John, Emma, and her parents down a sunlit corridor. Today has been quite good so far. She was quite responsive during morning activities. John nodded, tugging slightly at his borrowed collar. The clothes felt foreign after so long living rough, but they helped him look like the man he used to be, the man Caroline had married. "What should I expect?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Murray paused before a door decorated with watercolor paintings. Early-onset dementia affects everyone differently. Caroline retains strong emotional memories, even when specific details escape her. She might not remember exactly who you are at first, but she may recognize how she feels around you. Emma watched John's face as he processed this information. In the morning light, cleaned up and properly dressed, he looked younger, though anxiety had etched new lines around his eyes. She felt her mother's hand squeeze her shoulder supportively. "Would you like us to wait out here?" Sarah asked gently. John turned to Emma. "Would you come in with me? Just at first?" Emma nodded, understanding his need for an anchor in this emotional moment. Dr. Murray opened the door, revealing a bright room with comfortable furnishings and large windows overlooking a garden. Sitting in a plush armchair near the window was a woman with silver-streaked dark hair, elegant even in her simple clothing, working on a jigsaw puzzle. "Caroline," Dr. Murray called softly, "you have some visitors today." Caroline looked up, her brown eyes clear and curious. She studied John for a long moment, her head tilting slightly. "You look familiar," she said, her voice cultured and gentle. "Have you brought more puzzle pieces?" John took a hesitant step forward. "No, my love, just myself this time." Something flickered in Caroline's eyes at the sound of his voice. She set down the puzzle piece she was holding and stood slowly. "That voice. I know that voice." Emma held her breath as Caroline approached John, her movements deliberate but unstable. Dr. Murray stayed close, ready to assist if needed, but letting the moment unfold naturally. Caroline reached out and touched John's face, her fingers trailing over his neatly trimmed beard. "You used to read to me," she said suddenly. "Pride and Prejudice, over and over. Even when I couldn't remember the beginning by the time you reached the end." Tears spilled down John's cheeks. "Yes, my darling. Every night." "John?" The name came out as a question, but her eyes had brightened with recognition. "My John." "Yes, Caroline, I'm here." What happened next made Emma's heart swell. Caroline stepped forward and wrapped her arms around John, pressing her face into his shoulder. "You smell different," she murmured. "But you feel the same." John enveloped her in his arms, his body shaking with silent sobs. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I left you." "Left?" Caroline pulled back slightly, confusion crossing her features. "But you've been here." "In my dreams every night, reading to me." Dr. Murray caught Emma's eye and gestured subtly toward the door. Understanding, Emma began to quietly withdraw, leaving the reunited couple in their intimate moment. In the corridor, she found her parents waiting with barely contained emotion. "Is everything all right in there?" Sarah asked, wiping at her eyes. Emma nodded, her own vision blurry with tears. She remembers him. Maybe not everything, but she remembers how they feel together. Dr. Murray joined them, quietly closing the door. "This is remarkably positive," she said. "Caroline's emotional recognition is stronger than we typically see. Mr. Harrison's voice seems to be a particularly powerful trigger for her memories. What happens now? James asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. We'll monitor their interaction carefully, Dr. Murray explained. If things continue to go well, we can discuss implementing regular visits. Caroline's condition won't improve, but quality of life is incredibly important for dementia patients. Having Mr. Harrison back in her life, even if she doesn't always remember exactly who he is, could make a significant difference. Through the door's window, Emma could see John and Caroline sitting together by the puzzle table. He was holding her hand as she showed him the picture she was working to complete. A scene of an English garden in full bloom. Even from here, Emma could see the years of separation melting away as they fell into familiar patterns of interaction. Detective Collins called this morning, James said quietly to Dr. Murray. They're moving forward with the case against Marcus Blackwood. They'll need John to testify. One step at a time, Dr. Murray advised. Today is about reconnection. The rest can wait until tomorrow. Emma thought about the copy of Pride and Prejudice sitting on her bedside table, its pages worn thin with years of daily readings. Do you think, she began, then paused, considering. Do you think I could bring the book tomorrow? Maybe John could read to her again? Dr. Murray's face softened. I think that would be perfect. Familiar routines and activities can be very comforting for dementia patients. And perhaps, she glanced through the window at the reunited couple, perhaps you could join them sometimes. Caroline seems to respond well to young people, and you're already part of this story. As if sensing they were talking about her, Caroline looked up and caught Emma's eye through the window. She smiled, a bright, genuine smile that transformed her whole face, and waved. Emma waved back, realizing that this story of redemption and reconnection was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning a new chapter. The following morning brought a different kind of tension, as John Harrison sat in Detective Collins' office at New Scotland Yard. The building's imposing architecture and bustling corridors were a far cry from both the peaceful garden at the care centre and his recent life in the park. Emma sat beside him, having insisted on being present for moral support, while James Bennet spoke quietly with the detective near the window. Marcus Blackwood has been called in for questioning, Detective Collins announced, returning to her desk. He doesn't know about the USB drive yet, or about your return, Mr. Harrison. We want to observe his reaction when he sees you. John's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest of his chair. Will Caroline be safe? If he realizes I've come forward, we've stationed plainclothes officers at the care centre, James assured him. Dr. Murray has also implemented additional security protocols. Caroline is well protected. A knock at the door made everyone turn. Another detective entered, his expression serious. Blackwood's here. He's waiting in interview room 3. John stood, straightening his borrowed tie. Before we do this, there's something you should know about Marcus. He's persuasive. He can make anything sound reasonable, make you doubt your own memories. It's how he operated at the school for so long. Detective Collins nodded. We're well aware of his manipulative tendencies. That's why we've prepared thoroughly. Emma's father has been instrumental in helping us understand the financial aspects of the fraud. Indeed, James Bennet had spent the previous evening reviewing all the documentation, his accounting expertise helping to build an ironclad case against Blackwood. The evidence on John's USB drive, combined with James's analysis, had revealed a scheme far more extensive than initially suspected. Ready? Detective Collins asked John. He glanced at Emma, who gave him an encouraging smile. Ready? The interview room was smaller than Emma had expected, its walls a neutral beige, a single table with chairs the only furniture. Through the one-way glass, she could see a well-dressed man in his 60s, his silver hair perfectly styled, radiating an air of authority even while sitting alone. That's him, she whispered to John. Marcus Blackwood. John nodded, his jaw tightening. He hasn't changed a bit. Detective Collins entered the interview room first, while John waited just outside. Emma watched through the glass as Blackwood smiled pleasantly at the detective, every inch the respected educator. Mr. Blackwood, thank you for coming in, Detective Collins began, her tone professional. We have some new information regarding the financial irregularities at Bromley Grammar School. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. Of course, though I thought that unfortunate business was resolved years ago when John Harrison absconded with the funds. Interesting choice of words, Detective Collins replied, opening her folder. "Because we have evidence suggesting a very different sequence of events." She pressed a button on an intercom. "Please send him in." The moment John walked into the room, Emma saw Blackwood's composure crack, if only for a split second. His eyes widened, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the table's edge before he recovered. "John," he said smoothly, though his voice had lost some of its warmth. "This is unexpected. You're looking well." John took the seat across from him, his back straight, his expression controlled. "No thanks to you, Marcus." "I'm not sure what you mean," Blackwood replied, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. "You're the one who disappeared, leaving us all to deal with the aftermath of your actions." Detective Collins placed a laptop on the table, opening it to reveal one of the spreadsheets from John's USB drive. "Let's talk about actions, Mr. Blackwood. Specifically, the actions documented here regarding the school's renovation contracts." For the next hour, Emma watched a masterclass in interrogation as Detective Collins methodically laid out the evidence. John's quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to Blackwood's increasingly defensive responses. The former deputy head's polished facade began to crack as he realized the extent of the documentation they possessed. "This is absurd," Blackwood finally snapped, his cultured accent slipping. "You can't possibly believe the words of a man who's been living as a vagrant for 5 years over a respected educator." "Actually," Detective Collins countered, "we have corroborating evidence from multiple sources. Your brother-in-law's construction company, for instance, has been quite cooperative since we began our investigation." The color drained from Blackwood's face. "Timothy spoke to you?" "Family loyalty only extends so far when faced with serious fraud charges," Detective Collins observed. "He was quite helpful in explaining the kickback system you established." Emma watched as the last traces of Blackwood's composure crumbled. He turned to John, his expression ugly. "You think this changes anything? You still abandoned your post, your reputation? Your wife, the great John Harrison, living like a beggar rather than fighting back. What kind of man does that make you?" "A man who put his wife's safety above his own pride," John replied quietly. "Something you wouldn't understand, Marcus." Blackwood laughed bitterly. "And now what? You expect everything to go back to normal? Your wife's mind is gone, your career is in tatters, and your precious reputation—" "That's enough," Detective Collins interrupted sharply. "Mr. Blackwood, you're now formally under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and witness intimidation." As another officer entered to begin the arrest procedure, Blackwood's mask finally shattered completely. "You think you've won?" he snarled at John. "You've got nothing left. Nothing." John stood calmly, straightening his borrowed jacket. "You're wrong, Marcus. I have everything that matters. My integrity, my wife's love, and people who believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. What do you have?" Emma felt tears in her eyes as she watched through the glass. Here was the teacher from the photograph, the man of principle who had sacrificed everything to protect what he loved most. As Blackwood was led away, still hurling threats and accusations, John remained standing, dignity intact. When he emerged from the interview room, Emma hugged him impulsively. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," he corrected, including James and Detective Collins in his grateful glance. "All of us." Detective Collins closed her folder with a satisfied snap. "The Crown Prosecution Service will move quickly on this. Mr. Blackwood's threats against Caroline will be added to the charges. Speaking of which," she smiled, "I believe you have a reading session scheduled at the care center this afternoon." John's face softened. "Yes, Emma's bringing the book." As they left New Scotland Yard, stepping into the bright London afternoon, Emma noticed that John walked differently now, straighter, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The shadows of the past were finally beginning to recede, making way for something new. Hope. The reading sessions at London Neurological Care Centre quickly became the highlight of everyone's week. Emma had returned John's worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, but they'd also brought other books. A carefully curated selection of classics that Caroline had loved during their marriage. The care centre had transformed a small sunroom into their reading space, with comfortable chairs arranged around a vintage wooden table and soft afternoon light streaming through tall windows. "It is a truth universally acknowledged," John began one autumn afternoon, his voice carrying the familiar words with practiced ease, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Caroline sat in her favorite armchair, her eyes closed, a peaceful smile playing on her lips. Emma, watching from her usual spot by the window, noticed how Caroline's fingers moved slightly, as if conducting an orchestra to the rhythm of the words. Dr. Murray had explained that this was a good sign, muscle memory connecting to emotional memory. Sarah Bennett had taken to bringing homemade biscuits to these sessions, and the smell of ginger and cinnamon filled the room. Other residents had begun drifting in during the readings, drawn by John's expressive voice and the warm atmosphere. Even on days when Caroline was less responsive, these gatherings had become a source of comfort and community. "Do you remember," Caroline interrupted suddenly, her eyes opening, "when you proposed to me? You had that ridiculous copy of this book in your pocket." John's hands trembled slightly on the page. These moments of crystal-clear recall were precious and unpredictable. "I did," he replied softly. "I'd hollowed it out to hide the ring." "And you were so nervous you dropped it in the duck pond," Caroline continued, laughing. "Had to wade in after it, suit and all." Emma exchanged glances with her mother. This was a new story, another piece of the puzzle that was John and Caroline's life together. Over the past weeks, these fragments of memory had been surfacing more frequently during their reading sessions. Dr. Murray, who often observed these interactions, made notes on her tablet. The improvement in Caroline's engagement was remarkable, even if her condition itself couldn't be reversed. The routine of the reading sessions, combined with John's presence, seemed to provide an anchor for her memories. "The hospital board has been quite impressed with the success of these sessions," Dr. Murray had told them earlier that week. "They're considering implementing similar programs for other patients with early-onset dementia. Sometimes the best medicine isn't medicine at all." The news about Marcus Blackwood's arrest had spread quickly through the educational community. Several of John's former colleagues had come forward with their own stories, painting a picture of long-term manipulation and intimidation. The local paper had run a feature story clearing John's name, though he'd been more interested in the accompanying article about the care center's innovative reading therapy program. "Mr. Harrison," a small voice interrupted the reading. It was Lucy, one of the care center's youngest residents, who suffered from a rare neurological condition. "Could you do the voices again?" "Like yesterday?" John smiled, the expression transforming his face. These sessions had begun to restore not just his connection with Caroline, but his identity as a teacher, a storyteller, someone who could still contribute to others' lives. "Of course," he replied, clearing his throat dramatically. "In vain have I struggled," he continued in his best Darcy voice, making Lucy giggle. "It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Emma watched as Caroline mouthed the words along with him, her eyes bright with recognition. These moments of connection weren't just healing for John and Caroline, they had ripple effects throughout the care center. Other families had begun organizing similar sessions, bringing favorite books and memories to share with their loved ones. The local library had gotten involved as well, setting up a special collection of books for the care center and organizing volunteer readers. Emma's classmates from St. Margaret's had started a reading program, coming in on weekends to spend time with residents who didn't have regular visitors. "It's remarkable," James Bennett commented quietly to his wife, watching John interact with the small group that had gathered. "A month ago he was alone in the park, and now look at the community he's helped create." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of their worth." Emma saw it first, but now everyone can see the man he truly is. After the session, as they were helping to tidy up the sunroom, Caroline called Emma over to her chair. "You're the girl from the park," she said clearly. "The one who brought him back to me." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Caroline didn't always remember her role in the story. "I just shared my apple," she replied modestly. Caroline reached out and took Emma's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, dear. You shared your heart. That's a much rarer thing." She paused, her brow furrowing slightly with the effort of holding on to the thought. "I don't always remember everything, but I remember kindness, and you were kind when the world had forgotten how." John, overhearing this exchange, came to stand behind Caroline's chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The simple gesture spoke volumes about the connection that remained between them, even through the fog of illness. As the autumn sun began to set, Casting long shadows through the sunroom windows, Emma realized that healing came in many forms. Sometimes it was in grand gestures and legal victories, but more often it was in these quiet moments, in shared stories, in remembered love, in communities coming together to support one another. Dr. Murray had been right. The best medicine wasn't always medicine. Sometimes it was simply the recognition that every person, no matter their circumstances, had a story worth telling and a heart worth reaching. John and Caroline's story had started a movement, turning a simple act of kindness in a park into a ripple of positive change throughout the community. And it had all begun with a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice and the courage to see beyond appearances. As the date of Marcus Blackwood's trial approached, an extraordinary movement began to take shape in the community. The story of John Harrison had touched hearts throughout London, and people were determined to ensure justice would finally be served. The small office at Cook, Bennett and Associates, where James had been helping to prepare the financial evidence, had become an unofficial headquarters for supporters. "It's quite overwhelming," John admitted one evening, surrounded by stacks of letters from former students and colleagues. He sat at Emma's kitchen table, where the Bennett family had invited him for their now regular Sunday dinner. "I never expected such support. People remember good teachers, John," Sarah said, serving another helping of roast potatoes. "They remember those who made a difference in their lives." Indeed, the outpouring of support had been remarkable. Former students from Bromley Grammar had organized a social media campaign sharing stories about Mr. Harrison's impact on their lives. Many had gone on to become teachers themselves, inspired by his passion for literature and his belief in their potential. "Listen to this one," Emma said, picking up a letter. "Mr. Harrison helped me discover my love for Shakespeare when everyone else had given up on me. Today I teach drama at a comprehensive school in Manchester. His dedication to his students showed me what kind of teacher I wanted to become." John wiped his eyes discreetly. "Michael Thompson," he said softly. "He struggled with dyslexia, but he had such a gift for understanding character and motivation. I just helped him find different ways to access the text." The campaign had caught the attention of national educational organizations. The Teachers' Union had issued a formal statement of support, and several prominent educators had come forward to testify about the culture of intimidation that had existed under Blackwood's leadership. "The prosecution believes these testimonies will be crucial," James explained, passing the gravy boat. "They establish a pattern of behavior that supports your account of events." But perhaps the most touching support had come from the residents and families at the London Neurological Care Centre. Dr. Murray had helped organise a letter-writing campaign among those who had benefited from the reading programme that had grown out of John's sessions with Caroline. "The board is very interested in expanding the programme," Dr. Murray had told them during their latest session. "They're considering establishing a permanent position for a literary therapy coordinator, someone with experience in both education and working with dementia patients." The hint hadn't been lost on anyone. John had been spending more time at the centre, not just reading to Caroline, but helping other families establish their own reading routines with their loved ones. His natural teaching abilities, combined with his profound understanding of how literature could bridge emotional gaps, had made him an invaluable resource. "You should take the position," Emma said now, watching John help himself to more Yorkshire pudding. His appetite had improved significantly since those first days after leaving the park. "You're already doing the work, and everyone can see how much good it's doing." "But the trial," John began. "Will be over soon," James interrupted firmly. "And when Blackwood is convicted, you'll need to think about your future. You and Caroline both." The mention of Caroline brought a soft smile to John's face. Though her condition remained serious, the regular reading sessions had created a stability in her life that seemed to help anchor her memories. She had good days and bad days, but even on the difficult ones she responded to John's voice, to the familiar rhythms of their favorite books. "I've been thinking about that actually," John said, setting down his fork. "About the future. The care centre has offered me a small flat in their staff accommodation block. It would mean I could be closer to Caroline, more involved in her daily care." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's wonderful news, John. And," he continued, looking slightly embarrassed, "I've been writing about everything that's happened, about how literature can help heal broken connections, build bridges between people even when memory fails." Emma's eyes lit up. You're writing a book? More of a manual, really. For families and caregivers working with dementia patients. Dr. Murray thinks it could be useful, especially if the reading program expands to other care centers. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. James returned moments later with Detective Collins, who had become a frequent visitor to the Bennett household. "Sorry to interrupt Sunday dinner," she said, accepting the cup of tea Sarah immediately offered. "But I wanted to deliver this news in person. We've had a breakthrough. Marcus Blackwood's brother-in-law has agreed to testify against him in exchange for leniency." The kitchen fell silent as the implications sank in. Timothy's testimony would corroborate everything on John's USB drive, providing the final piece of evidence needed to ensure a conviction. "There's more," Detective Collins continued, pulling out her tablet. "The examination of Blackwood's finances has revealed substantial offshore accounts. The fraud went far beyond Bromley Grammar. We've uncovered similar schemes at 3 other schools where he worked previously." John sat back in his chair, looking stunned. All those years, he must have been doing this for decades. "The prosecution is updating the charges accordingly," Detective Collins confirmed. "With the new evidence, they're very confident about the outcome." Emma watched as John processed this information. She could see the weight of the past 5 years lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter. Hope, perhaps, or vindication. "You know what this means," Sarah said, already heading to the cupboard where she kept special occasions wine. "It means we can start planning for after. For your new life, John." As Sarah poured glasses of wine for the adults and sparkling apple juice for Emma, the kitchen filled with a sense of anticipation. Through the window, Emma could see their neighbors' lights coming on as evening settled over their quiet street. Somewhere in those homes, she knew, people were reading John's story in the evening paper, sharing their own memories of teachers who had made a difference in their lives. "To new beginnings," James proposed, raising his glass. "And to the power of community," Detective Collins added. "To second chances," Emma said softly. John looked around the table at these people who had become his unlikely champions, his new family. "To kindness," he said simply, "and to those who remember to share it." The glasses clinked as darkness fell outside, but in the Bennett's kitchen, light and hope burned bright. The Old Bailey stood imposing against the grey London sky, its weathered stone facade a testament to centuries of justice served within its walls. Emma sat between her parents in the public gallery, watching as John Harrison took the witness stand. He wore a new suit, a gift from the teachers' union, and carried himself with quiet dignity. Marcus Blackwood sat at the defense table, his previously immaculate appearance somewhat diminished by weeks in custody. His expensive legal team surrounded him like a protective barrier, but even they couldn't mask the tension in their client's shoulders as John began his testimony. "Please state your name for the court," the prosecutor began. "John Michael Harrison." "And your former occupation?" "I was head of English at Bromley Grammar School for 15 years. The prosecutor nodded, moving to stand where the jury could clearly see both John and Blackwood. "Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened 5 years ago." John's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as he recounted his story. He spoke of discovering the fraudulent contracts, of his growing suspicions, and of Blackwood's subtle threats regarding Caroline's care. The jury listened intently as he described his impossible choice to fight and risk his wife's well-being, or to disappear and protect her. "And how did you live during these 5 years, Mr. Harrison?" "I lived rough," John replied simply. "In parks, mostly. I kept my wife's favorite book with me, Pride and Prejudice. It helped me remember who I was, even when I'd lost everything else." Emma noticed several jury members wiping their eyes. In the row reserved for press, journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This was more than a fraud case now. It had become a story about love, sacrifice, and redemption. During cross-examination, Blackwood's lawyer attempted to question John's credibility, suggesting that living on the streets might have affected his memory or judgment. John's response silenced the courtroom. "My circumstances may have been reduced," he said quietly, "but my integrity remained intact. I could have sold my story years ago, exposed everything. Instead, I chose silence to protect my wife. Ask yourself, what kind of man gives up everything to protect someone he loves, and what kind seeks to profit from others' misfortune?" The defense lawyer had no response to that. Timothy Blackwood's testimony followed, laying bare the intricate web of fraud his brother-in-law had constructed over decades. Bank records, contracts, and emails flashed across screens in the courtroom, each piece of evidence another nail in Marcus Blackwood's coffin. During a break in proceedings, Emma found John in the courthouse corridor, staring out a window at the city below. "Are you all right?" she asked, joining him. "I keep thinking about Caroline," he replied. "Doctor, Murray is reading to her right now. We agreed it would help maintain her routine, but part of me wishes she could be here to see this." "She knows," Emma said confidently. "Maybe not the details, but she knows you're fighting for her. She feels it every time you read to her." John smiled, the expression softening the stress lines around his eyes. "When did you become so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she replied, making him chuckle. The afternoon session brought character witnesses, former colleagues and students sharing stories of both men. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where Blackwood's witnesses spoke of intimidation and fear, John spoke of inspiration and support. Michael Thompson, the former student with dyslexia who now taught drama, gave particularly moving testimony. "Mr. Harrison didn't just teach us literature," he told the court. "He taught us to believe in ourselves, to see beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath, rather like Elizabeth Bennet learning to see the real Mr. Darcy." The literary reference brought a smile to John's face, and Emma could see several jury members nodding appreciatively. As the day drew to a close, the prosecutor delivered her closing argument. She spoke not just of the financial crimes, but of the human cost of Blackwood's actions. The lives disrupted, the careers derailed, the families affected. But she also spoke of resilience, of the power of community, and of how truth, though sometimes delayed, would always find its way to light. "The evidence before you is clear," she concluded, "but perhaps the most damning testimony comes not from documents or witness statements, but from the choices these two men made. When faced with adversity, Marcus Blackwood chose to threaten and intimidate. When faced with an impossible choice, John Harrison chose to sacrifice everything to protect those in his care. These choices reveal the true character of these men, and it is on character that this case ultimately turns." The jury filed out to begin their deliberations as the autumn sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. In the public gallery, Emma sat with her parents, Charlotte, Detective Collins, and a group of supporters who had come to witness this moment of reckoning. "Whatever happens," Sarah whispered to John, who had joined them to await the verdict, "you've already won. Your name is cleared, your story is known, and you have your life back." "And Caroline," Emma added softly. John nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. Around him, the community that had formed in the wake of a simple act of kindness in a park waited with him, their presence a testament to the power of seeing beyond appearances, to the truth of human hearts. Outside, London carried on its evening rush, unaware of the drama unfolding within the Old Bailey's walls. But in that courtroom, as they awaited the jury's decision, something profound was taking place. The slow but inexorable triumph of truth over deception, of kindness over cruelty, of justice long delayed but finally served. The jury took less than 3 hours to reach their verdict. As the court reassembled, Emma could feel the tension in the air. John sat straight-backed in his chair, his expression calm but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The Bennet family and their supporters filled several rows of the public gallery, a silent wall of solidarity. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury forewoman stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of fraud in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." "On the count of embezzlement of school funds?" "Guilty." "On the count of witness intimidation?" "Guilty." With each pronouncement, Marcus Blackwood seemed to shrink further into himself, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. When the judge announced a sentence of 12 years in prison and full restitution of the stolen funds, a collective exhale swept through the courtroom. But it was the judge's closing remarks that brought tears to many eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone measured but stern, "you abused not only your position of authority, but the trust placed in educators to nurture and protect. Your actions caused immeasurable harm to many, none more so than Mr. Harrison and his wife." She turned her attention to John. "Mr. Harrison, while the court cannot restore the years taken from you, we can acknowledge your extraordinary sacrifice and courage. Your story reminds us that true character is revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how we face our darkest hours. As they left the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps clamored for statements. John, usually shy of publicity, surprised everyone by approaching the microphones. Emma watched proudly as he addressed the cameras, his teacher's voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Today isn't about revenge or retribution," he began. "It's about truth and the power of community to bring that truth to light. 5 years ago, I lost everything except what mattered most, my integrity and my love for my wife. Today, thanks to the kindness of strangers who became friends, I've regained not just my reputation but my faith in humanity." He gestured to Emma and her family. Her young girl saw past appearances to offer kindness to a stranger in a park. That single act set in motion a chain of events that brought us here today. If there's a lesson in all this, perhaps it's that we should never underestimate the power of simple human kindness. The statement made headlines across the country, but John was already focused on his next challenge. The Care Centre's Board of Trustees had called an emergency meeting to discuss the expansion of the reading therapy program. Dr. Murray's data on its positive effects, combined with John's newly restored reputation, had attracted significant interest from healthcare providers nationwide. "They want to establish a pilot program," Dr. Murray explained during their next reading session. Caroline sat nearby, contentedly working on a new puzzle as she listened to their voices. 10 care centers across the country, with you as the program director, John. Your story, combined with your teaching experience and personal understanding of dementia care, makes you uniquely qualified. "But Caroline," John began. "Would remain here, of course," Dr. Murray assured him. "The pilot program would be headquartered at this facility. We're already converting the old administrative wing into a training center, and that staff flat we discussed is yours whenever you're ready." Emma, who had been quietly arranging books on a newly installed shelf, spoke up. "The students at St. Margaret's want to help too. We've established a volunteer reading program. 20 students so far, with more signing up every week." John looked around the sunroom that had become their sanctuary. New, comfortable chairs had been added to accommodate the growing number of participants in their reading sessions. The walls were now lined with bookshelves, each volume carefully chosen for its potential to spark memories and connections. "I never imagined," he said softly, "when I was sitting on that park bench, that life could lead here." Caroline looked up from her puzzle, one of her increasingly frequent moments of clarity lighting her face. "You always did say books had magic in them, darling." The simple statement, so perfectly timed, brought joyful tears to everyone's eyes. John crossed the room to kiss his wife's forehead, and Emma noticed how naturally they fit together, even after all this time apart. Later that evening, as Emma walked home with her parents, they passed through Highbury Fields. The park had transformed with the seasons, but the bench where she'd first met John remained unchanged. A few days earlier, someone had placed a small plaque on it. "Kindness changes everything." "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked her daughter, "when you offered that apple and water, what would come of it?" Emma shook her head, remembering that autumn afternoon that felt both recent and long ago. "I just saw someone who needed kindness. Everything else—" She gestured at the park around them, now a symbol of transformation and hope. Everything else was the magic John talked about. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the park, where so many lives had changed because one person chose to see beyond appearances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The pilot program to launch, more lives to touch, more stories to share. But for now, in this moment, everything had come full circle. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, other stories of kindness were waiting to begin. Other lives waiting to be transformed by the simple act of seeing the humanity in every face, the potential for redemption in every heart. 1 year later, the autumn leaves were once again falling in Highbury Fields as Emma Bennett hurried through the park. Now a university student studying English literature at King's College London, she still made time every week to participate in the reading program that had grown far beyond their initial dreams. The London Neurological Care Centre had been transformed. The newly established Literary Connections Institute, with John Harrison as its director, occupied an entire wing of the building. Teachers, healthcare workers, and volunteers from across the country came to learn how to implement similar programs in their own facilities. As Emma approached the center, she could hear the familiar buzz of activity from the main reading room, once a quiet sunroom, now a warm and vibrant space filled with books, comfortable chairs, and the murmur of dozens of voices reading aloud. The walls were lined with photographs documenting the program's journey, including one particularly special image, John and Caroline on the bench in Highbury Fields, taken the day he received his official appointment as program director. "There you are," Sarah Bennett called from the reception desk, where she now volunteered 3 days a week. "They're waiting for you in the celebration room." Today was special, the first graduation ceremony for the Literary Connections training program. 20 care facilities across Britain had sent staff members to learn the methodology John had developed, combining traditional teaching techniques with the latest research in memory care and emotional connection. Emma entered the celebration room to find it packed with familiar faces. Dr. Murray was chatting with healthcare administrators from Edinburgh and Manchester. Detective Collins, now a regular supporter of the program, stood with James Bennett near the refreshment table. Charlotte, who had founded a similar reading program at their old school, was helping to arrange certificates. And there in the center of it all were John and Caroline. Caroline was having one of her good days. They had become more frequent over the past year, though her condition itself hadn't improved. She sat regally in her favorite chair, John's hand resting lightly on her shoulder as they greeted the gathering crowd. Just in time, John smiled as Emma approached. "We saved your favorite part for last." The ceremony began with speeches and presentations, but everyone was waiting for the traditional closing ritual. John took his place in the reading chair, Caroline beside him, and opened their well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, the same book that had started everything. But this time he didn't read alone. One by one, each graduate of the program joined in, their voices creating a harmony of shared purpose and understanding. Emma watched as the residents responded, some mouthing the familiar words, others simply swaying to the rhythm of the language, all connected by the power of story and human contact. Later, as the celebration wound down and the autumn sun painted the room in golden light, Emma found herself back at the photo wall. A new addition caught her eye, a framed copy of the lead article from last Sunday's Times. Literary Connections program receives National Healthcare Innovation Award. "Quite a change from park benches and water bottles," John's voice came from behind her. He had aged during the past year, but it was the gentle aging of peace and purpose, not the harsh wear of survival. "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked. "The quiet of the park?" John chuckled. "Sometimes. But then I remember the loneliness, the fear." He gestured at the busy room around them. "This is better. This is life." Caroline approached, leaning on her walker, but moving with determination. "Are you two talking about the past again?" she asked, her voice clear and amused. Though she still had difficult days, the routine of the reading sessions and John's constant presence had created a stability that defied medical expectations. "Just remembering where it all began," Emma replied. "Ah yes, the apple and the book," Caroline nodded. She had heard the story so many times that it had become part of her permanent memory, one of the few stories she could reliably retain. "You know, dear, you never did tell us what made you stop that day." Emma looked around the room at the graduates preparing to take this program back to their own communities, at the residents engaged in animated discussions about their favorite books, at her parents who had opened their hearts to a stranger's struggle, at John and Caroline, reunited against all odds. "I saw someone reading," she said simply. "Not a homeless man, not a scandal, just someone finding comfort in a book." Everything else grew from that moment of recognition. The setting sun streamed through the windows, catching the gold lettering on the Institute's wall. "Every story matters." Below it, dozens of letters from families touched by the program had been framed, each one testifying to the power of connection, of seeing beyond surfaces to the heart beneath. John wrapped an arm around Caroline as she began to tire. "Time for our evening reading?" he asked softly. "Only if Emma joins us," Caroline replied with a smile. "After all, she's part of our story now." As they made their way to their favorite reading corner, Emma caught fragments of conversation from around the room, plans for expanding the program, discussions of new techniques, stories of breakthrough moments with residents. The ripples of that first simple act of kindness continued to spread, touching more lives with each passing day. The sun had almost set by the time Emma left the center, taking her usual route through Highbury Fields. The park was quiet now, the evening air crisp with autumn's promise. As she passed the bench where it all began, she noticed a young woman sitting alone reading. Without hesitation, Emma sat down beside her. "Good book?" she asked. The woman looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. And so another story began, as stories always do, with one person choosing to see another, truly see them, and reach out with an open heart. After all, in a world that too often rushed past the quiet moments, sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple question about a book.